Nanjing Massacre. On December 13, 1937, 2 years before Hitler's invasion of Poland and what many scholars regard as the true opening of World War II in Asia, Japanese troops seized the Chinese capital of Nanking after weeks of relentless combat. What unfolded in the aftermath descended into one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. For 6 harrowing weeks, Japanese soldiers killed no fewer than 100,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed troops, with most historical assessments placing the death toll between 200,000 and 300,000. Death came in countless forms. Along the banks of the Yangtze River, mass executions were staged. Thousands were forced into lines, cut down by machine gun fire, and cast into the flowing water. Elsewhere, soldiers moved from home to home, pulling men into the streets to be executed. Captured Chinese soldiers were herded to predetermined killing sites, bound together, and shot. Historians are united in acknowledging that sexual violence was widespread throughout the massacre. Innumerable women and girls were assaulted, many losing their lives in the process. Amid the terror, John Rabe, a German businessman who remained in Nanking, created a safety zone that ultimately shielded nearly 200,000 civilians. Rabe and other foreign residents chronicled what they witnessed through diaries and photographs, secretly sending evidence beyond the city's borders. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, offered refuge to thousands of women at Jinling College, even as soldiers repeatedly forced their way in to seize victims. At first, the Japanese military concealed the acre, and when accounts finally reached the wider world, they were dismissed as enemy propaganda. In the war's aftermath, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo. General Iwane Matsui was found guilty of failing to stop the atrocities and was executed in 1948. Lieutenant General Hisao Toni was put to death by Chinese authorities in 1947 for his direct involvement in mass killings. Still, many of those responsible were never brought to justice. Today, the Nanking Massacre remains a point of deep contention. Efforts by some Japanese officials and school textbooks to minimize or deny its scale continue to fuel unresolved historical wounds and enduring diplomatic strain between Japan and China. Unit 731. Between 1936 and 1945, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a secret biological and chemical warfare research program in Manchuria, known as Unit 731. Under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, the unit conducted grotesque experiments on living human subjects, mostly Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed enemies of the state. At least 10,000 people were killed in the experiments themselves, and some researchers argue that tens of thousands more died in field tests across China. The facility, located near Habon in northeast China, was disguised as a water purification unit. Inside, prisoners were infected with diseases like plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid to study the progression of infection without treatment. Subjects were dissected while still alive and conscious to observe the effects on living tissue. Frostbite experiments involved freezing limbs and then testing different methods of thawing them. Reports from former staff and post-war testimonies describe that some prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to different parts of their bodies. Others were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out or were spun in centrifuges until death. Flamethrowers and grenades were tested on live prisoners tied to stakes. The unit also conducted field tests, releasing plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands. Water supplies were poisoned with cholera and typhoid. Contaminated food was distributed to villagers. Prisoners were referred to as logs, dehumanizing them completely. Guards were told that the subjects were not human, which made the torture easier to carry out. As the war ended in August 1945, Unit 731 destroyed most of the evidence. Buildings were blown up, remaining prisoners were killed, and documents were burned. The staff fled back to Japan. After the war, the United States granted immunity to Ishii and his top researchers in exchange for their data on biological warfare. This information was considered too valuable to lose, even though it had been obtained through mass murder. No one from Unit 731 was prosecuted by the Americans. Some members were later tried by the Soviet Union in the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949, where 12 were convicted and received prison sentences. Ishii himself lived freely in Japan until his death in 1959. Bataan Death March. On April 9, 1942, following months of brutal combat on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, roughly 76,000 Filipino and American troops laid down their arms to Japanese forces. It marked the largest surrender ever recorded in U.S. military history. What came next would be etched into history as one of the Pacific War's most infamous crimes. The defeated soldiers were driven into a forced march that soon turned into a procession of suffering and death. Already emaciated by hunger, illness, and constant fighting, the prisoners were compelled to trek more than 60 miles under the crushing tropical sun toward distant prison camps. Compassion was non-existent. Guards routinely beat, stabbed with bayonets, or shot anyone who slowed, begged for water, or attempted to aid a fellow captive. The captives were crammed together so tightly that some died from suffocation alone. Food and water were withheld for days at a time. When the march passed artesian wells, Guards frequently barred prisoners from drinking, executing those who tried. Some men were deliberately left sitting for hours beneath the open sun with no shelter. Others were reportedly buried alive as a warning to the rest. Disease swept through the columns. Dysentery, malaria, and beriberi claimed countless lives before the march even ended. Corpses littered the roadside. Estimates indicate that between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino soldiers perished, along with roughly 500 to 650 Americans. Survivors who reached Camp O'Donnell found no relief. The camp itself was a place of despair, plagued by extreme overcrowding, filth, and unchecked disease, which killed thousands more in the months that followed. At Camp O'Donnell alone, about 1,500 American prisoners and some 26,000 Filipinos died within weeks of arrival. After the war, survivor testimonies revealed the full scale of the march's horrors to the world. Japanese General Masaharu Hama, commander of forces in the Philippines, was brought before an American military tribunal in Manila in 1946. He was convicted of war crimes for failing to restrain his troops or prevent the atrocities. Hama was executed by firing squad on April 3, 1946. Several other officers connected to the Death March were likewise tried and put to death, leaving the Bataan Death March as a lasting symbol of human cruelty and suffering during wartime. Nanjing Massacre, early 1940 in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939. Thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, police officials, and members of the nation's elite were detained in Soviet prison camps. They were men seen not merely as prisoners, but as the backbone of a nation that refused to be erased. In the spring of 1940, under a secret directive approved by Joseph Stalin and the Politburo, their fate was sealed. Around 22,000 detainees were systematically executed in absolute secrecy. The largest contingent, approximately 4,400 Polish officers, was transported to the Katyn forest near Smolensk, where they were killed with a single bullet to the back of the head and buried in mass graves. Additional executions were carried out at detention sites in Kalinin and Kharkov. Those murdered were not soldiers alone. Among them were doctors, lawyers, professors, teachers, engineers, and priest figures who embodied Poland's cultural, intellectual, and moral leadership. The intent was clear. By destroying the nation's guiding class, resistance could be broken and control made absolute. After execution, their bodies were quietly moved and concealed, as if history itself could be silenced. For decades, the Soviet state denied any role in the killings, placing the blame squarely on Nazi Germany. When German forces uncovered the mass graves at Katyn in 1943, they publicized the discovery for propaganda purposes. Although much of the evidence they presented was factual, the Soviet Union continued its denial, even accusing Germany of the crime during the Nuremberg trials. After the war, Poland fell under Soviet influence, and any public mention of Katyn was strictly forbidden. Families who spoke of the truth faced harassment, intimidation, or imprisonment. Silence was enforced not only through fear, but through erasure. It was not until 1990, during the period of glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, that the Soviet Union formally acknowledged responsibility. Declassified documents revealed Stalin's own signature authorizing the executions. In 2010, the Russian State Duma issued a statement recognizing Soviet culpability and expressing regret. Yet the massacre has never been officially labeled genocide, nor have perpetrators been prosecuted. Memorials now stand in Poland and in other countries, but for the families of the victims, the search for full justice and unambiguous recognition continues, an echo of truth that refuses to be buried. Manila Massacre. In February 1945, as American forces closed in on Manila to liberate the city from Japanese occupation, the Japanese troops trapped inside unleashed a final wave of calculated violence. For nearly a month, Manila descended into hell. An estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed, marking the Manila Massacre as one of the deadliest urban atrocities of World War II. Knowing defeat was inevitable, Japanese forces turned their fury toward the defenseless population. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi ordered his naval units to hold Manila and fight to the last man, directly defying General Tomoyuki Yamashita's command to withdraw. As the battle intensified, soldiers moved methodically from neighborhood to neighborhood, erasing entire families as if civilian life itself had become the enemy. At the Red Cross building, doctors, nurses, and patients were slaughtered without mercy. At the German club, refugees were locked inside and the building was set ablaze, burning hundreds alive. Those who attempted to flee were cut down by machine gun fire. At the Bayview Hotel, Japanese troops imprisoned hundreds of women and girls, subjecting them to repeated sexual violence. Paco Church became a site of execution when priests and civilians sheltering inside were murdered, their bodies later burned. One of the most horrifying scenes unfolded at Manila Cathedral, where soldiers massacred refugees, women and children, included using bayonets and grenades. This devastation was not random chaos. Buildings were deliberately destroyed, blown apart, or burned as part of a systematic annihilation of the city. By March 3, 1945, American forces had secured Manila, but the city lay in ruins, its streets soaked with trauma and loss. After the war, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was tried by an American military commission in Manila, although he had ordered his forces to retreat. He was held accountable for failing to control his subordinate, Admiral Iwabuchi, who died during the fighting. Yamashita was convicted and executed in February 1946. The trial remains deeply controversial, with critics arguing that a commander should not bear responsibility for atrocities committed by subordinates acting against direct orders. For the chosen ones, the Manila Massacre stands as a solemn reminder: when authority loses conscience, its shadow can devastate generations long after the guns fall silent. Oradour-sur-Glane, on June 10, 1944, only 4 days after the Allied landings in Normandy, a shadow fell over a quiet village in central France. Soldiers from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich encircled Oradour-sur-Glane, a place untouched by war until that moment. The division had been ordered to move north to confront the Allied invasion, but along the way they were delayed and angered by repeated resistance attacks. Frustration hardened into cruelty. Oradour was chosen not for what it had done, but for what it could represent: a warning written in blood. At approximately 2 p.m. SS troops sealed every road leading in and out of the village. Loud orders rang out, commanding all residents to assemble in the main square for what was described as a routine identity check. The soldiers claimed they were searching for weapons and resistance members. It was a lie. Men were separated from women and children. The women and children were herded into the village church, its doors locked behind them. The men were split into smaller groups and marched to barns, garages, and sheds scattered around Oradour. Inside these buildings, machine guns were already waiting. Without warning, the SS opened fire not to kill immediately, but to cripple. Bullets tore into the men's legs, dropping them to the ground in agony. Then straw and firewood were piled onto their bodies. Flames were lit. The wounded were burned alive. Any man who tried to crawl away was shot on the spot. Inside the church, the women and children heard the gunfire and screams. Panic spread. Then the soldiers brought in an incendiary device, possibly a smoke bomb or explosive, and ignited it. Thick black smoke filled the church. Fire followed. As mothers clutched their children and tried to escape through doors and windows, SS soldiers fired into the crowd. Many suffocated before the flames reached them. Others burned together where they stood. One woman, Marguerite Ruffange, survived by leaping from a window behind the altar. Though she was shot and wounded as she fled, she would be one of the very few. By the end of the day, Oradour-sur-Glane was silent. Out of 642 villagers, 90 men, 247 women, and 205 children were murdered. Only 7 people survived the massacre. After the killings, the SS looted the village, then systematically set every building on fire. Bodies were left where they fell. Days later, when French authorities arrived, they found charred remains still lying in the church and barns. By order of Charles de Gaulle, the ruins were never rebuilt. They were left exactly as they were, a permanent wound, preserved as a memorial. In 1953, 21 men were put on trial in Bordeaux. 14 were German SS soldiers. 7 were Frenchmen from Alsace who had been forcibly conscripted into the SS. The trial divided France, as many saw the Alsatians as victims themselves. Most sentences were light, and many of the convicted were released within a few years. For the chosen ones, Oradour-sur-Glane is not just a historical tragedy. It is a warning etched into stone and ash, a reminder of how quickly obedience without conscience can turn ordinary places into eternal graves. Bobby Yar. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, a ravine on the outskirts of Kew became a place of absolute annihilation. At Bobby Yar, German forces carried out one of the largest single mass executions of Jewish people during the Holocaust. In the span of just 48 hours, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were systematically shot and killed. The operation was planned by SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich Jeckeln and coordinated with Einsatzgruppen units, supported by German order police, Wehrmacht soldiers, and Ukrainian auxiliary police. It was not chaos, it was organized death. After the German occupation of Kyiv, official notices appeared across the city. Jews were ordered to gather on the morning of September 29th, instructed to bring documents and belongings. The message promised relocation. Many believed they were being evacuated. Tens of thousands obeyed, walking quietly toward what they thought was survival. Instead, they were driven toward the ravine of Bobby Yar. As they neared the site, the illusion collapsed. Valuables were confiscated. Clothing was stripped away. Families were torn apart in silence. Then, in small groups, people were marched to the edge of the ravine. There, they were forced to lie face down atop the bodies of those already killed. A bullet to the back of the head followed. Layer upon layer of human bodies filled the gorge. Witnesses later said the ground itself seemed alive for days afterward. As some victims buried beneath others struggled and suffocated in the darkness, the killing did not end with those 2 days. In the months that followed, Bobby Yar continued to consume lives. Jews who had gone into hiding were discovered and brought there. Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists, and patients from psychiatric hospitals were also executed. By the time German forces withdrew in 1943, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 people had been murdered in that ravine. As defeat approached, the perpetrators attempted to erase their crime. In August 1943, prisoners were forced to exhume the decomposing bodies, burn them on makeshift pyres, crush the remaining bones, and scatter the ashes. The work lasted weeks. When it was finished, those forced laborers were themselves executed, silenced forever. After the war, the truth was buried again. Soviet authorities suppressed the Jewish identity of the victims, referring to them only as Soviet citizens. For decades, Babi Yar stood without proper recognition. There was no marker of who had died there, no acknowledgement of why. It was not until 1976 that a monument was erected, and even then it spoke in vague terms, refusing to name the Jewish dead. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did Ukraine begin to openly and honestly commemorate the massacre and those who were lost. Some justice followed, but it was incomplete. Paul Blobel, the officer responsible for organizing the destruction of evidence, was executed in 1951. Others received prison sentences. Many were never held accountable at all. For the chosen ones, Babi Yar is not only a grave, it is a voice. A reminder that truth can be buried, delayed, denied, but never erased. The earth remembers. And so must we. The bombing of Dresden. On the night of February 13, 1945, as the Second World War neared its end, the skies over Dresden ignited. The British Royal Air Force unleashed the first wave of what would become a devastating sequence of air raids against the German city. Over the course of 2 days, British and American bombers released nearly 4,000 tons of high-explosive ordnance and incendiaries, triggering a firestorm that swallowed Dresden's historic heart. The number of dead has been argued over for generations, but careful modern research places the toll at roughly 25,000 lives. Even today, the destruction of Dresden stands as one of the most hotly debated Allied actions of the war. Though the city lacked extensive heavy weapons manufacturing, it functioned as a crucial administrative and transportation center. By early 1945, it had also become a place of refuge, overflowing with civilians fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. Dresden's population, once around 640,000, had surged beyond 1 million. On the evening of February 13, more than 700 British Lancaster bombers descended in 2 carefully timed waves. The first assault dropped high-explosive bombs designed to shatter roofs and windows, tearing buildings open. Minutes later, the second wave released incendiaries into the exposed interiors. Together, these strikes created a firestorm and inferno so intense it generated its own hurricane-like winds. Temperatures soared beyond 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen was ripped from the air. Those hiding in shelters suffocated as the flames devoured everything above them. Others who fled into the streets were caught in violent gusts that dragged bodies back toward the fire. Survivors later spoke of scenes that defied comprehension. The heat was so extreme that human bodies disintegrated into ash. People ran through the streets engulfed in flame, transformed into living torches by the storm of fire. The following day, American bombers arrived, aiming for rail yards and infrastructure. Yet residential areas were struck as well, deepening the devastation. In the aftermath, Dresden lay in ruins. German authorities gathered thousands of bodies and burned them in mass pyres in the old market square. More than 1,600 acres of the city's center had been erased, reduced to smoldering rubble and silence. Even after the war, the bombing stirred unease among those who carried it out. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the architect of the raid, defended it as a lawful strike against a transportation hub critical to German operations on the Eastern Front. The Allied position held that Dresden's rail network supported ongoing military movement. Yet critics argued that by February 1945, Germany's defeat was already inevitable, and that the destruction served little strategic necessity. The debate was further clouded by Nazi propaganda. Joseph Goebbels inflated the death toll to fantastical figures exceeding 200,000. Numbers later echoed and sensationalized in the post-war years. Modern scholarship has dismantled those exaggerations, grounding the tragedy in documented reality. Still, the question remains unresolved in the collective conscience. Was Dresden a necessary act of war, or a moral line crossed too late to matter militarily? For the chosen ones, Dresden is a lesson etched in fire. It reminds us that victory does not erase suffering, and that even in the name of liberation, the cost can echo through history, demanding remembrance, reflection, and truth. The Tokyo firebombing on the night of March 9, 1945, the sky above Tokyo darkened with approaching aircraft. 334 American B-29 bombers flew in low, releasing nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary weapons onto the city below. What followed became a single night of destruction unlike anything the world had seen before. The attack unleashed a firestorm that claimed an estimated 100,000 lives and hours, marking it as the deadliest air raid in human history. The operation was directed by Major General Curtis LeMay, who had grown disillusioned with high-altitude precision bombing against Japan's dispersed industry in resilient cities. Those tactics had failed to deliver decisive results. LeMay chose a different path. Instead of factories alone, entire urban districts became the target. Tokyo's neighborhoods, built largely of wood and paper, were vulnerable by design. The bombers descended to altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, low enough to evade many Japanese defenses and increased accuracy. They released M69 incendiary cluster bombs, which burst open mid-air and scattered napalm-filled bomblets across the city. On impact, the fires ignited instantly. Individual blazes fused into a single, unstoppable inferno. Winds exceeding 100 miles per hour were drawn inward as the heat created its own violent atmosphere, mirroring the firestorms seen in Europe. Temperatures soared beyond 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Glass liquefied, metal warped, canals began to boil. People fled in desperation. Some plunged into water tanks or canals seeking relief, only to be cooked alive by the superheated water. Others collapsed as the flames stripped oxygen from the air. Panic turned streets into death traps as crowds stampeded through smoke and fire. Survivors later said the air itself seemed to burn, and that human beings ran through the city engulfed in flame, transformed into living torches. The inferno raged for hours, erasing more than 16 square miles of Tokyo. By dawn, an estimated 1 million people were homeless, and entire districts had vanished into ash. In the months that followed, similar incendiary raids were carried out against dozens of other Japanese cities, adding hundreds of thousands more civilian deaths. The strategy was clear: shatter morale, collapse resistance, and force surrender without a costly ground invasion. After the war, these bombings were never prosecuted as war crimes. LeMay himself later acknowledged the moral edge of victory, admitting that had the United States lost, those responsible would likely have stood trial. Memory of the Tokyo firebombing diverges sharply across nations. In the United States, it is often framed as a grim necessity, an act believed to have shortened the war and saved lives that would have been lost in an invasion. In Japan, it endures as a national wound, a night when tens of thousands of civilians were consumed by fire. Today, a memorial hall in Tokyo stands in quiet remembrance of the victims. For the chosen ones, this chapter of history is not merely about strategy or victory. It is a reminder that when fire is unleashed without restraint, it burns far beyond the battlefield, leaving scars that echo through generations and demand reflection, humility, and truth. The WWII Massacre. Just outside Vilnius, Lithuania, in a wooded area known as called Ponry by the Germans, a vast killing ground operated from July 1941 until August 1944. During those 3 years, German forces, aided by Lithuanian collaborators, murdered an estimated 70,000 to 100,000 people. Most of the victims were Jews, making WWII one of the largest execution sites of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. Before the war, the forest concealed deep, unfinished fuel storage pits that had been dug into the earth but never completed. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, these abandoned excavations were transformed into mass graves. Einsatzgruppen units working alongside Lithuanian auxiliary police began transporting Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and Polish intellectuals to the site. The victims were deceived. Many were told they were being relocated for work. Instead, upon arrival, they were ordered to surrender their belongings, strip off their clothes, and line up at the edges of the pits. Shots followed. Bodies tumbled into the excavations below. These executions occurred almost daily for nearly 3 years, with entire families wiped out together. Although German officers oversaw the operation, Lithuanian collaborators frequently carried out the shootings themselves. As the Red Army advanced in 1943, the Nazis moved to erase their crimes. Jewish prisoners were chained together and forced to exhume the corpses, burn them on pyres, and grind the remaining bones into fragments. This forced labor unit became known as the Burning Brigade, enduring months of unimaginable suffering. On April 15, 1944, 11 members of the brigade escaped through a tunnel they secretly dug. Their survival and testimonies later became vital evidence of what had occurred. The remaining prisoners were executed before the Germans withdrew from the area. After the war, Soviet authorities deliberately minimized the Jewish identity of the victims, describing them only as Soviet citizens. For decades, no monument openly acknowledged the true nature of the massacre. It was not until Lithuania regained independence in 1990 that proper recognition began. Today, WWII stands as a memorial and museum, a silent witness to systematic annihilation. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing and feel free to leave suggestions for future videos in the comments.